Howdy, Armelian here. Welcome back to my beautiful basement. This time I'm going to cover some details about how the fire passives and fire durations and tick rates and therefore fire DPS actually works in the game. I've had a couple of questions about these things lately and I thought I'd make a quick video just covering these topics. So let's get into it. Almost all fire skills have two portions to them, the initial damage and a fire over time, damage over time effect. We also have two passives that directly influence all the direct damage skills and the damage over time skills. Highly flammable. The first part of it actually simply modifies the damage numbers of all of your fire skills. It increases the minimum damage and the maximum damage, and therefore obviously also the average damage. It also has the second portion, which is fire time. And this is a bit confusing to some people, but this does not increase the amount of ticks you get for a damage debuff, as in the fire damage over time portion of your flame fist, of your fire arrow, of your fireball, of your ring of fire, and of your immolation. This fire time actually only modifies the amount that your skills last, as in how long your immolation lasts and how long your ring of fire lasts. The duration is also modified by your skill level in these skills, so it's not very obvious how it works, but this is how it works. In other words, this fire time does not increase your damage per skill use for flame fist, fire arrow, fireball, and it does not increase your damage per application of the ring of fire debuff, but obviously if it lasts longer, it's under some scenarios it will mean that your ring of fire will deal more damage because it gets applied more times. Alright. Then fire speed. I'm not going to cover the range part of this skill. It's fairly simple. It affects your range to all of your fire skills including flame fist. But the fire speed portion is actually very interesting. A lot of people seem to think or are under the impression, understandably again, that when you read your fire arrow, blah blah damage every 1.4 seconds for some duration of time, that fire speed actually increases the amount of or has breakpoints depending on the part every 1 point something seconds, and that's what determines your damage per second for the damage over time effect. That's actually not the case. I'll get to those a bit later, but everything else being equal, your every single fire damage over time effect has a set amount of damage ticks. For example, you can quite easily do the math, how many ticks at my skill levels I have for fire arrow and I have for ring of fire, and this every 1.4 number is actually a rounded number. The actual math is more accurate, and there's really no reason to be looking at that number because it doesn't really represent anything meaningful. Instead, you should be looking at the 420, in this case 21.4 seconds part. This is actually what determines your damage per second or damage per minute for these effects. This, as I said, it's a set amount of everything else being equal. It's a set amount of damage ticks that gets applied over this duration, the 21.4, and the 1.4 part is just a rounding. The damage actually changes more accurately based on your fire speed than is displayed with the every 1.4 second number, and there is no breakpoints that have to do with the 1.4 or the 1.5 or 1.3 or whatever. So that's how this works. Now to get to the very nitty gritty, you can actually see that a lot of the fire skill dots share durations, and this is because they, at least on equal skill levels, they share durations, and this is because they have the same math for the amount of ticks they get. You can see that at my skill level, actually I'm not going to look at Flame Fist because it's a bit lower than my other skills, but I'll show the other ones. This applies X ticks over 21.4 seconds, so does my Ring of Fire. At equal skill levels, which is the case here, these have the same amount of ticks. 1.4 seconds over 17.1, 1.4 over 8.6. Again, you can see this is actually half the ticks of my immolation. 1.4 over 17.1 at this skill level as well. So you can see that there's some basic math. Basically, you have an amount of ticks. I'll get to the damage ticks. I'll get to this later. And it is applied over a period of time. And this time is modified by your fire speed skill. The math operates on one decimal, which means there are some breakpoints to this. Actually, the decimal of your fire speed skill does not get applied because the actual stat is 1.40, for example, in my case right now. So 1.400, but this is kind of irrelevant because you can only get to the breakpoints by testing. So what this means is that when you're rising your fire speed skill, the optimal way to raise it is wait for you to get your duration for Ring of Fire and therefore also for Fire Arrow modified, and then stop training it, and when you train it again, train it until this duration gets modified again. You can also do this with choose your Flame Fist and, for example, Fireball duration as the duration to determine when you stop training if you want to. So that's pretty much everything, but what determines the amount of ticks you get for one application of a fire dot? That's actually your skill level in a given skill, and every single skill has their own multipliers, but some of them are shared, as you can actually see. You can see that Fire Arrow and Ring of Fire have the same modifiers. What you can also see is that if I trained my Ring of Fire by 20 points, I would get 2 additional ticks to this skill. You can do the math easily by just looking at what my values would be at 150 and what they are right now. This means my Ring of Fire would, the debuff portion of it would, or the damage over time portion of it would tick at the same rate, but it would have 2 additional ticks. These skill levels sorry, my headphones turned off for some reason. Anyway, these breakpoints for getting that 1 additional tick are actually actual breakpoints, as in it's possible to train your Ring of Fire skill, let's say 5 skill points, not get any benefit to this part of the skill, but then train it 1 more additional point and you would get that extra tick. These breakpoints I haven't researched yet. They are fairly random seeming. For example, I did a little bit of testing on an alt and you get 1 extra tick for Fire Arrow and Ring of Fire at skill level 34, for example. So when you're training your fire skills, you should be looking at the amount of ticks you have, and when you get that extra tick, that's probably a good point for min-maxing your experience efficiency to stop training that skill. Yeah. You can also see that, for example, for immolation I would not get another tick for training the skill. So training immolation has other benefits, but not that one. I would get an extra tick, but only 1 extra tick for training Fire Arrow. I would get 2 extra ticks for training Ring of Fire. I wouldn't get an extra tick for the DoT part of my Fireball, and so on and so on. So yeah, I know this is a kind of confusing. I wouldn't remember anything if I was listening to this description of how it all works, but just something that if you want to really understand how your DPS is determined by your passives, by your skill levels, by in the case of fire damage, I'm sure you got something out of this, and thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.